So I've had this channel for about 3 years now, and looking back on the catalog of videos I've made for the Distributist, I've realized that there has been one problem that's come up again and again and again. And that problem has been the problem of epistemology, specifically epistemology in really hard problems, in problems with quite a bit of uncertainty. The first live talk that I uploaded to this channel, and indeed one of the more popular videos that I've ever created for this channel, was the talk entitled Understanding the Cult of Confidence. In that video broadly, I discussed modern man's desire for confidence, and how that desire for confidence and obsession with confidence led him to choose tools that were ultimately ineffective at understanding the universe, and much less accurate. But as I've continued my YouTube career, I found this question of how do we answer hard questions coming up again and again and again and again. I don't want to downplay this or make it more than it is. This is one of the central questions of human existence. How do we know truth? What tools do we take to the exploration of truth? But at the same time, I find it somewhat interesting that behind every ideological and moral disagreement, there also seems to be an epistemological disagreement, a methodological disagreement. Briefly returning to the question that really kicked off this channel to begin with, I wanted to re-ask the question, how do humans answer hard questions? And see really what the different options are. What tools do we have at our disposal, and what are the common mistakes when we try to use those tools to come to an answer to a question that is very hard and has a large amount of uncertainty associated with it? Now, as I've said from the outset, this is one of the fundamental questions that humans have had to deal with since they've existed on planet Earth. I'm certainly not going to completely give an exhaustive list of answers to this central question, but I did want to give my viewers a window into how I tend to look at the question, what I see as the common answers to this question, and what I see as the most common mistakes when people try to pick tools to understand the universe and to answer very hard questions. So with that in mind, let's get started. Say we have a question, a really hard question, about human existence, about the best way to organize humans socially. It's a well-posed question, it means something, people have asked it consistently. It is also a question that has real human impacts. We can see the results, the consequences of answering it in a good or bad way. Nevertheless, the answer to said question doesn't seem to have a very obvious answer, and if it does have answers people have offered, there seem to be a lot of inaccuracies. There seems to be a lot of uncertainty. This could be a question such as, what is the ideal form of social government? How should we compensate soldiers for risking their lives in battle? Whether equality of outcome or equality of opportunity are worthwhile political goals for human societies to pursue, or whether humans thrive more in diverse or homogeneous environments. All of these questions are relevant, but none of them really have very simple answers at all. In fact, if you take a look at any of the modern controversies that rule either the ballot box or even that are talked about here on YouTube, you'll see quite clearly that people are debating questions that don't have simple answers, questions that can't simply be answered by going to a Wikipedia article to get the generally agreed upon consensus. These are the questions that really rule the roost when we tackle issues that have to do with politics, culture, and really anything to do with human society that matters at least. These questions are uncertain, vague in their consequences, and also seem to return again and again and again, despite the fact that we might think they are settled. But given that we have these difficult questions, what tools would we use to try to get an accurate or a close to accurate answer when taking them on? What methods do humans have available to them when they are seeking truth, when they're trying to uncover the correct path and the secrets to a good or better life? As we might expect, this question has a lot of answers to it, and I would think even more mistakes. Let's start with some of the more common answers. Now, if you've been through middle school, or had you asked a teenage version of myself, or any internet atheist, there is one two-word answer to this question you're probably expecting, and that two-word answer is scientific method. Yes, sir, this is the common method that we all learned in junior high school. The process of asking a question, constructing a hypothesis, doing an experiment, analyzing the results, and reporting a conclusion. And we shouldn't knock this method. It's been the most revolutionary process, perhaps in all of human history. And the use of this scientific method has resulted in the massive expansion of our understanding of the physical universe and all its complexity. And the method is very simple. Ask questions, construct a conjecture or hypothesis, and then try to validate and disprove that hypothesis. And instantly we come to an understanding of the universe that is more truthful, more accurate, and properly called scientific. But while the scientific method remains an easy answer to really any question about how to understand the universe, once we fully understand how it works, we will see that it is not necessarily the panacea the new atheist community oftentimes claims it is. The way the scientific method functions is in reducing uncertainty, reducing wrongness by controlling the environment. We ask one question at a time, and we try to construct an environment, construct an experiment that will test out that one question without any other interfering noise or variables getting involved. This involves a number of assumptions that they don't necessarily teach you in middle school science. The first requirement is that we can even construct an experiment, in the sense that we can control the input and output. This is something that can quite easily be done in a number of physical and chemical applications, but is almost impossible to do in genuine social interactions when humans try to understand themselves. Human experimentation in the social sense is very seldomly something that is as straightforward as mixing chemical compounds. We're not units that have a bunch of modular buttons that can be pressed. Moreover, human experimentation on the mass scale is almost impossible, and in the era of institutional review boards is, at this stage, flatly illegal. And this leads directly to the next requirement for any kind of scientific method to be applied, and that is the controllability of variables. The scientific method is designed to observe one variable at a time, and if interfering variables, interfering factors, are constantly modulating and controlling the results, no good conclusions will ever be necessarily observed. And this goes doubly for the single variable that most often interferes with experiments of a social nature, and that is the experimenter's bias themselves, which seems to be always and everywhere present when we tackle issues of society, politics, and culture. Under these circumstances, what should ordinarily be a controlled and repeatable method becomes something of a Rashomon experiment, with different scientists seeing different things, emphasizing different factors and different results, and no real conclusions coming to the fore. And this all contributes really to the third requirement, and that is repeatability. Under these circumstances of not having stable experiments, not having control over factors or observations, and combined with a fair amount of just plain old noise and uncertainty, really no conclusions will be at all repeatable, will be able to be replicated by other teams working elsewhere and with slightly different circumstances. As a result, when it comes to these really hard questions that we mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the social questions, the political questions, the cultural questions, most fields of sociology don't really seek to perform the scientific method, but seek to do things that look like they're performing the scientific method, that only seem like they're going through the steps of the scientific method, when really none of the core requirements of any of those steps is ever respected, because they can't be. In essence, most of what we consider sociology, due to its uncontrolled nature, is, at its very best, only pseudoscience. Which is not to say that it's fraudulent at all, but just that it's not really actually using this method if we're really honest about it. It's making an observation on an uncertain system that is more or less uncontrolled and not independent. In short, this is not the same thing as mixing two chemicals together or splitting an atom in a cyclotron. And if we convince ourselves that this is the same thing, we're essentially checking into a lot of self-deception. We need other methods to answer hard questions, and there's really no way around that. And I know nothing I say here is going to convince any of the I effing love science people online. They'll still go on about the scientific method, never really reading the fine print, as if all they really got from any of their science classes was the scientific method is best method. But really, there's nothing we can do about this. The flaws are as they are, and we have to look elsewhere. So where is the next place we look for a methodology to discern truth concerning hard questions? Well, following the model of education, we can go to the next great tool most people arrive at in their intellectual development, and this is the logical or reasonable argument. This is a method that most people pick up in their logic or math classes, usually coming off more advanced forms of geometry or calculus, or even introductory classes on philosophy. The method goes something like this. From mathematics and from philosophy, we have generalized and formalized rules of thought, non-contradiction, syllogism, the excluded middle, etc., etc., etc. If we treat statements in philosophy, if we treat statements about reality as if they are formal linguistic objects, the same way we treat formal statements in mathematics, we can apply these rules of thought to the statement and demonstrate that they are false if they contain a contradiction in them. We can also demonstrate, for instance, that one statement is logically and necessarily connected to another, not by any observation, but simply by the formalized statement itself, combined with our rules for thinking that link the truth tables of one statement to the truth tables of another statement. Thus, to borrow a mathematical example, we can prove that a triangle, at least under the assumptions of Euclid, necessarily has to have the properties of the Pythagorean theorem. Similarly, we can prove, under some minimal assumptions, that if Socrates is a man, he must therefore be mortal. Saying the Pythagorean theorem applies to an object is part of what we mean when we say that an object is a triangle, and saying that Socrates is a man necessarily implies that Socrates will one day die. They are connected formally, logically, and no observation can break this connection. While at once this seems like a much more airtight way of going about things than the scientific method, which has any number of caveats, I feel that even this rationalistic approach comes in for a fair amount of abuse, in our modern era at least. And I think this really owes to the fact that we don't understand what we're really doing when we do mathematics, when we do logical reasoning. Now, Neoplatonists perhaps notwithstanding, mathematics and logical statements are largely simply a formalized language with formalized rules of meaning. When people construct mathematical arguments, when they construct philosophical arguments, they are simply making assertions about what some statement ultimately means by definition. The Pythagorean theorem is part of the formalized definition of a triangle. Mortality is part of the formalized definition of being a man. And if you notice a pattern here, the definition is always central in this construction. The logic and the rationality we apply after the definition is more or less just extending it, coming to the full consequences for what we mean by our own words. Without a larger concept of the spiritual or Platonic forms, it's not necessarily clear that by doing mathematics or logic we're actually operating on real objects. We are just operating on linguistic objects. Now, this is a caveat, but people might wonder how this practically encounters problems, especially when we take this methodology to large questions like, is democracy good? Is capitalism good? Is socialism good for humanity? Well, here, instead of encountering an intractable scientific problem, I think we'll see that we've encountered an intractable definitional problem. Very few words we use in our ordinary political or cultural discourse have very formalized definitions, and therefore the application of these ultra-rational and logical formulations really doesn't, at the end of the day, mean anything that's that significant. You can always come up with a toy definition of the thing you don't like and prove that it's bad, or come up with a toy definition of something that you do like and prove that it is logically equivalent to something good. But at the end of the day, these arguments are going to be a function of the definition you've given that thing. At the end of the day, very few objects, I suspect, are logically linked to some bad outcome or some good outcome. That would, in some sense, be astonishing. Usually the most significant thing a logician can do inside a real political or cultural argument is show that one side's ideas are incoherent, e.g. they contain an internal contradiction. But in most cases, aside from exposing cognitive dissonance, this usually simply means that one side hasn't formulated their arguments correctly, and indeed that side needs to slightly restructure their arguments and self-definition. something that's good to keep in effect, but it's not really going to give us the correct answer to a hard question. It's more or less just going to make sure that we talk in a clear fashion, that we're not legitimately deceiving ourselves by believing in A and not A at the same time and in the same way. Once more, I highly suspect that what people get off on when they constantly call out fallacies and errors in logic is the appearance that doing these logical arguments on politics and cultural issues is the equivalent of doing them on mathematics. Just as in the scientific analogy, really none of the assumptions carry over, and really all we have is sort of a pseudo-mathematics at the end of the day. Not a very good methodology at all. And I think that this is disappointing for a lot of people, but I think something that needs to be kept in mind. There's a reason why people who constantly cite irrationality and fallacies are irritating, and that is that they never really accomplish anything. They're usually just nitpicking. But is there something we can do that's not nitpicking? Is there a way we can move beyond these two naive methods? I think the next possible answer to our question that typically comes up in people's mind is to try to come up with a general consensus of the scientific community, a general consensus of rational people who've examined this question. And in our own modern era, where we are obsessed with everything that is scientific, usually this means going to a snapshot of the scientific literature on any given topic. Perhaps one experiment could be wrong due to interference of different factors or a limited data set. Perhaps one methodology might be fundamentally flawed or biased, but if we go to the general consensus in the literature, we will be able to defeat these problems in the aggregate. So let's just go to Google Scholar, type in our question, and try to find scientific papers, scientific studies that seem to answer this question with a reasonable amount of certainty and with a reasonable amount of proximity to the specific case we're trying to deal with in our present day. This is a methodology that I think is incredibly popular among modern progressives, especially among modern liberal progressives of the more moderate progressive variety. I think we'll see the reason why this method is popular among a certain type of progressive of a moderate liberal persuasion if we push on the flaws of this method a little bit more. Oftentimes you'll see figures on YouTube like Destiny or Christy Winners using this a lot. They'll always have all sorts of studies to back up their points of view. They'll read the names and potentially a sentence or two from the abstracts of certain authors, and will treat that as undiluted truth, as the consensus that we should follow. As we might expect, there are a lot of problems with this method, mainly because it is just the macrocosmic version of method or answer number one. As we looked at previously, very few of these hard political, sociological, or cultural questions can be well posed in a scientific methodology. They don't have controlled experiments, they have too many factors, and bias always creeps in. When we try to aggregate in studies, we're hoping that the bias will cancel out, that the bias of one researcher will go in direction A, and the bias of the second researcher will go in direction B. But given the persuasion of the modern academy, it's very, very likely that all of the biases will point in the exact same direction. Thus, modern research has a tendency to confirm the presuppositions of people in the modern academy, which is probably why people of a moderate progressive disposition like using this method so much. But the problems go even deeper. Because of the fact that sociology and political science journals like mimicking the methods of science so much, there typically is a bias towards small, controlled experiments, small sample sets where the variables can be reasonably limited. The hope always is, of course, that these results will scale up, but there's nothing that will necessarily make that the case in the messy field of human relations. Moreover, there's a bias towards quick questions that can be discerned on a survey. Studies that go over long longitudinal data are much harder and necessarily have much more limited data sets. And if you come out with a result that's controversial or that may be embarrassing to other people in the community, especially if it's embarrassing in a direction that is politically inconvenient, your study is going to have a much harder time getting published. So what is the ultimate result of all of these problems? Well, simply open up Google Scholar and see how the scientific consensus analysis treats any one of the hot-button issues of our day: gay marriage, transgenderism, etc., etc., etc. One study goes one way, one study goes the other. The consensus is very, very hard to discern, and the review papers that tackle the issues tend to have some very distinct biases. They will describe the research being done and then essentially discard all of the papers that go in the opposite direction because they have certain methodological flaws, which are of course implicit in the entire field generally. Now, I want to provide an example here, and I'm tempted to go over any one of my dissatisfaction with the research involving transgenderism, or gay marriage, or the psychological effects of abortion for that matter, but to take a much less controversial note that will nevertheless illustrate my point, I'm going to take a very, very classic industrial example of the experiment of Coke versus Pepsi. Now, if you're an 80s or a 90s kid like myself, you'll remember something called the Pepsi Challenge. This was a marketing campaign undertaken in the franchise wars of the 1990s, where a rival company called Pepsi-Cola was trying to unseat the market dominance of Coca-Cola, which is, of course, America's #1 favorite soft drink. Now, if you're a market rival trying to unseat the king, you really need to pump the gas. You need to tell your audience what the reason is that they need to switch from the product that they're used to your product, and that means demonstrating value. And for Pepsi, that value was demonstrated in the Pepsi Challenge. Their product, Pepsi-Cola, was more delicious than Coca-Cola, and they could prove it. The advertisers for Pepsi-Cola would sit down with random strangers set aside and feed them tiny little Dixie cups of each of the product, Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola, just like any good scientist would before the experiment began, which was of course double-blind. The interviewer from Pepsi would ask the subject whether he preferred Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola, and of course, being America's #1 soft drink, the subject would usually answer that he preferred Coca-Cola, after which a blind taste test in the little Dixie cups was administered, and the interviewer would ask, which one did you prefer? And 9 times out of 10, the subject would answer Pepsi-Cola. Wow, a double-blind experiment was conducted and we got our answer. It was a blind taste test, wasn't it? And unlike most sociological experiments, it was repeatable. The Pepsi people did this again and again and again. It wasn't just a marketing stunt. You could go into any crowd of people, give a little Dixie cup of Coca-Cola and a little Dixie cup of Pepsi-Cola, and 9 times out of 10 they would pick the Pepsi-Cola. And in fact, just to remove the bias from the entire procedure, Coca-Cola did this experiment with their own subjects and found, sure enough, that the Pepsi Challenge was won by Pepsi. People preferred Pepsi-Cola in blind taste tests in small quantities. And Coca-Cola could see this in their very own double-blind market research. This would have been a result that would have been easy to publish had it been a psychological or sociological result. And so, given this new information, what did the Coca-Cola Corporation do? Well, they did what any modern scientifically minded person would do. They acted on the evidence. Our product is a soft drink. It sells because it tastes good. If it's losing a taste test to an alternative product, then we need to come up with a different formula that beats that product in the blind taste test. And so the Coca-Cola Corporation came up with a new flavor for Coke. They relaunched it, remarketed it, and of course they had studies showing that people preferred new Coke to Pepsi or old Coke, so certainly they would win. Huzzah, the scientific method triumphs. And of course, because we use the scientific method, this product was a great success, right? Well, of course, no, it wasn't a great success. It was a horrible bomb. The new flavor for Coke was immediately unpopular with people, and it almost destroyed the company, so that within less than a year, Coca-Cola was pulling the new recipe for Coke and going back to its old one, reinstating Coca-Cola Classic, which was a marketing success. Such a success, in fact, that Coca-Cola, in fact, recaptured much of the ground it had lost to Pepsi-Cola. Till now, most people are only familiar with Coca-Cola, and Pepsi is really only served in a few franchise restaurants. So what was the mistake? Why did the majority of the blind test studies that would have been published if there were journals of soft drinks, why did the collection of those studies point in the wrong direction? Well, in short, it's because they were too limited. They didn't understand the full scope of the product that was being sold inside the soft drink Coca-Cola. Why was the Pepsi challenge done in Dixie cups with a blind taste test? People didn't drink Coke and Pepsi out of Dixie cups. They had large glasses of the soda and they usually drank them with a meal. Moreover, when they bought a can of Coca-Cola or a can of Pepsi, they bought a label and they would have the can sitting there, and there would be a certain feeling of drinking Coca-Cola. The experiment of feeding soda to people in Dixie cups really had no real relation to how the product was actually being consumed in most contexts. The reason why the experiment had been done that way was the easiest way to conduct a double-blind experiment. The experimenter wasn't going to sit there and watch people eat their entire dinners with 2 different sodas in quick succession. That's not how the thing worked. The enjoyment people take out of taking a quick shot of a drink usually has to do with sugar and flavor, hard sensations that strike quickly, and Pepsi had that kind of pep and jolt in it that was much more noticeable than Coke, which is why when people got it in small quantities, they preferred it. However, in contexts of drinking it with a meal or drinking it over a long period of time, people tended to prefer a more subdued flavor, which is what the original Coke had and had made the original Coke popular. Moreover, the marketing and the label of the drink played a role in the overall user enjoyment of the product. And this was key and something that was just not present in the studies that were being handed to the Coca-Cola executives. And it resulted in a distinct bad decision coming from an overestimation of a scientific result. And what was so funny about the whole scenario, what was so crazy about the whole decision to switch the recipe of Coke, was that any person, any businessman's instinct should have instantly been to not change the formula of the Coke, and to especially not change the label. Selling beverages to people is not a new thing in human civilization. We've been doing it for years. And to go to one of humankind's oldest beverages, wine, we have long-standing records over wine tastings and wine preferences inside culinary and viticulture communities. And it is well known that people drink the label. People prefer to have labels that are familiar to them. That's part of the experience. Furthermore, any wine connoisseur knows that the labels that win the wine taste testing contests are not always the best wines to pair with a meal, or the ones that are most popular among people who know about wines. For instance, I'm a native of California, and it's long been a point of pride for people in our state that we classically win wine contests with some of the top-shelf French wines. If you give the Pepsi challenge to the California versus the French wine, the California wine typically wins. But when you ask most culinary experts, they always prefer French wine to pair with their meals. So is this all a marketing gimmick? Is this all a big deception? Are food connoisseurs kidding themselves? Well, not necessarily. The label of the wine is part of the experience of the meal, and it shouldn't be discounted. Furthermore, we shouldn't expect a small sip taste test to match or even necessarily correlate with preference inside meal or culinary environments. People who pair French wine with their fine dining tend to get a better experience, and we should believe them on that, regardless of what the studies say. And if you had a good understanding of history, and you had a good understanding of the history of beverage drinking among humans, you would understand this fundamental rule. So why did no one in the Coca-Cola Corporation see this? Well, it's because they were in some sense blinded by science. And this implicitly brings us to the next answer, the next method that we might use to solve hard and complicated problems. And this is to appeal to wisdom, intuition, and the general understanding that we might take from history and what has worked in the past. Now, people of my particular background, which tend to be academic and technocratic, tend to scoff at this position. They tend to laugh at folk wisdom and understanding things through patterns that we might discern very sloppily from history, but this tends to work very well. Most business ideas and business decisions are done on instinct, are done on intuition. We see an idea and it seems like it will work. We didn't do experiments on the idea, we didn't sit down on a chalkboard and prove that the idea by definition must work. We saw something that was very much like something that worked very well in the past, and we copied it. We followed intuition and wisdom from the past. After all, those instincts that we have in our head didn't get there by accident. They're a product of 10,000 years of evolution, which we've had to use to survive in very hostile environments. They're likely to contain learnings from that enormous period of time that might be something beyond what we can understand in our very limited experiences. Similarly, those traditions that we followed and used to guide our lives didn't just get there by accident. They're the collective composition of many different generations' wisdom, many different generations' experience. And unlike many scientific studies that exist in the literature mainly because they looked good and had publishable results, we know that the knowledge that built our traditions because it allowed our ancestors to survive under very, very hostile environments. There actually is a result that we can see from it because we are the result. Our survival, our presence here is the result. And that's a very powerful piece of information. That's a very powerful tool that I think we ignore at our own peril. But just as I think moderate progressive liberals tend to lean a bit too hard on the consensus of small scientific studies when they go to discern the truth in hard to answer questions, I think moderate conservatives lean a little bit too hard on this folk wisdom and tradition-based perspective. If you've spent much time in moderate conservative or traditionalist circles, you've probably heard a lot of quotes that support this idea of traditionalism containing information and wisdom from Burke and a variety of other thinkers. Moreover, perhaps because I have Chesterton as my icon, I've heard over and over and over and over again that same quote that Chesterton has about the fence. If you come across a fence that's strewn across a road and have no idea why it's there, you shouldn't tear it down until you figure out why it's been put up in the first place. Sure, that's wisdom. That is profound, and would be profound if I hadn't heard it 10,000 times. But there is such a thing as leaning on traditional wisdom too hard. After all, times have changed, and if we are just giving in to our instincts or letting tradition take the wheel, we are more or less just going on autopilot. We're not doing the job of actually thinking for ourselves. And I think a lot of conservatives and traditionalists use this very thinking to justify their own complacency in the light of a world that's changing rapidly before their very eyes. In short, this method is too comfortable. It's not in itself sufficient. And I don't want to be like the Japanese Tokugawa shogunate, only discovering that the world has fundamentally changed once Admiral Perry's gunships force themselves into Japanese ports. Nobody likes rude awakenings, especially rude awakenings that could have been avoided with a little bit of forethought. So fine, this method isn't perfect either, but is there one method that I prefer over all others? Is there a way of understanding the universe that might combine several of these methods? Well, I think there is, and this brings me to the last method. The method that most engineers and practical scientists use, and that method is modeling. How does this generally work? Well, we take a complicated system that we can't necessarily get good, complete experiments on, and that we cannot fully describe all aspects of, and we create a simpler version of it. A scaled-down version of it that we believe capture the most important qualities and the most important outputs. We require that this simplified model be coherent, it's logically consistent and does not contain contradictions inside of it, and we can make sure that for the most part, this model confirms most scientific findings that exist in the literature, and to the extent that it runs contrary to some scientific findings, that we have a good explanation as to why existing data did not confirm it in this way and in this instance. We might have an understanding why certain scientists observed things working in a different way, but still be more or less convinced that this model captures the mainstay of the effect, and for our applications is a good predictor of how the real world, much more complicated system, actually works. Furthermore, we can use this model looking backwards to traditional and historic wisdom and ask how much this model and the rules it provides confirms or disconfirms our instincts. How, if this model were used by our ancestors, it would work or not work for their applications. Obviously, if this model would work going back, that would be a confirming piece of evidence. And if it would not, if it's counterintuitive or seems to run against the traditional way of doing things, we should, like the man in Chesterton's fence, have a reasonable explanation over how things have changed and how this update is a reasonable modification and adaptation to circumstances changing on the ground. And as always, when we go forward with a model, we must be cautious that what we are dealing with is not reality, but just a model. I like this method because it seems to get to the best of both worlds. We have a way to incorporate wisdom from the past and compare it with scientific evidence in the present. We can read studies and analyze them with the assumption of the model being true and see how much it confirms or disconfirms our understanding of the universe. Moreover, we can check our beliefs for coherency. For instance, if the model describes whether we should allow or disallow young people to physically alter their bodies to conform themselves to their emotional opinion of how they should look, and this model recommends that young people be able to get surgery for that end, we could use, of course, studies that show people being reasonably satisfied with sex reassignment surgery to bolster our belief in this model. But we would simultaneously have to reconcile this with our belief that young people and teenagers should not be given access to plastic surgery and surgical alterations to give themselves better cosmetic looks, more distinct secondary sex characteristics, as many teenagers probably would if this was normalized. The model brings the question to the fore and forces us to answer it, and for this reason I'm fairly comfortable with this method, this primary way of addressing complicated questions. It's my go-to methodology generally. But is this method perfect? Are there no flaws with this? Well, not really. In many ways it has all of the different flaws of the various other approaches we bring to understanding the universe. A model is only as good as the data that validates it, and if we have garbage going in, we're going to get garbage going out. Models can be based too heavily on tradition and instinct, and even if we are updating them in a Bayesian sense to account for new occurrences and changes in assumptions, there's no guarantee that we're going to be doing that fast or adequately enough to meet the requirements of our quickly changing times. People could bring any number of model assumptions to the table. No model is going to fit the data perfectly, and if a model does fit the data perfectly, it's likely to be inaccurate. It's likely to be so complicated and convoluted that it really has no ability to handle the general uncertainty in life. It, in other words, is overfit. And finally, and lastly, when it comes to modeling, there always is the natural human tendency for us to fall in love with our own models. No pun intended, of course. We begin to think that the model we've been using to discern reality is reality itself, when really, this is never the case. Even in physics, it's probably not the case. The overuse of models will, of course, lead to a category of thinkers that, like all humans are wont to do, have fallen into their own method of doing things and can't see their way out. As the statistician Box is famously been quoted as saying, and this is a quote that never has gotten old in my opinion, all models are false, but some models are useful. And this is something that I think we can never say too much. When I address a question, when I tackle a problem, I want to know what's at stake, when I need to make my answer, how uncertain that answer can be, and what are the consequences for getting a false positive or false negative. From that, I can bring myself to the construction of a model and the creation of a decision that, all things being equal, might be better than the alternatives. Could I be wrong? Is there a large probability that I made a mistake? That's a distinct possibility. But going forward, I really believe that if people are aware of how they're tackling problems, if people are aware of the tools they're taking to handle questions that are very difficult, that have a high probability of being wrong, that have a large amount of uncertainty, if we're aware of the tools we're using, we're going to be more honest with ourselves about the kind of conclusions we're coming to. And this, if nothing else, I think, can be a path to a clearer and better way of communicating about the controversial and difficult questions that really define our present age. At least, this is the best model I've been able to figure out for the present time.